There have been a lot of people who, at various points over the years, Vince McMahon saw something special in. Sometimes this worked out and resulted in huge stars like Hulk Hogan, The Rock, or John Cena. However, other times it hasn't quite gone as planned, with the likes of Lex Luger, Giant Gonzalez, or in the early days of Roman Reigns' singles run. And while today's subject might ultimately fall into that latter category, this is not to say his career was a failure, because despite his main event run in the mid-90s never really panning out like the boss had hoped it would, he still managed to make multiple returns over the years, carving out a nice spot for himself with many different gimmicks. But how did he get to that point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in Man on a Mission, The Mabel Story. Nelson Frazier was born on February 14, 1971 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and it was there that he would grow up with an early love of the world of pro wrestling. Yes, whether it be the territory days of the 70s or the rise of the WWF in the 80s, the youngster took one look at what he was seeing on TV each and every week and quickly realized it was what he wanted to do himself. Of course, given his gargantuan size at 6'9", this would be made a lot easier for him because, with a youngster looking like someone who would immediately turn heads in an airport, doors opened for him everywhere he went. So it was then he would make his start in the United States Wrestling Association in 1991, there performing under the name of Nelson Knight, one half of the Harlem Knights tag team alongside Bobby Knight. And together, the Harlem Knights would make a pretty quick impact down in Jerry Lawler's territory, mowing their way through pretty much every team on the roster, all before they then jumped over to the Pro Wrestling Federation for a time and won their tag team titles on 2 separate occasions. Yes, it was a lot of early success for the young duo, but as it happened, it was only just the beginning, because after Lawler had reported back to Vince McMahon about the potential stars he had on his roster, the boss would check them out for himself, then decide to sign both of them to a contract in 1993, rebranding them from there as Mabel and Mo, Men on a Mission. That's right, this one was WWF's attempt to capitalize on the growing popularity of hip-hop music at the time, as seeing the likes of Tupac and Biggie Smalls dominating the charts, McMahon felt like it was time to bring in his own rapping duo. The only problem with this, though, was that neither Mabel nor Mo could rap, so instead, Greg Girard would be brought in to play Oscar, their rhyming manager, with him dropping verses every time they came to the ring, all before he'd then sit back and let his team do the actual fighting. And fight they did, because pretty quickly, Men on a Mission would start racking up victories in the tag team division. In fact, at one point, they would even get a count-out victory over then tag team champions, the Quebecers, at WrestleMania 10, with a brief tag title run coming a year later when they beat the champs at a house show in London, England. But while this run would only prove to be fleeting when, 2 days later at a show in nearby Sheffield, the Quebecers would win their titles back, it did show that the company was listening to the ever-growing reactions the babyfaces were receiving from audiences and were preparing them for even bigger things to come as a response to this. Unfortunately, though, any momentum they were building as a team would be stalled when Mo injured his leg not long after this, with the whole incident leading to Mabel having to go it alone as a singles act for a time instead. That said, this wasn't exactly the start of a major push for him or anything like that. No, quite the opposite in fact, because during this period, the big man would mostly be used to get other, more experienced wrestlers over, giving them a big man they could beat in order to make them look stronger than they actually were. So that's why Mabel must have been thankful when his tag partner returned in late 1994 then, as this took him out of his glorified enhancement talent role and allowed him to resume his quest to regain the tag team titles. And this quest would eventually see Men on a Mission turn heel for the first time when, upon growing frustrated after being beaten by the Smoking Guns, they would attack their opponents, laying them out as, from there, they dropped the rapping part of their gimmick and instead began being portrayed as more ruthless villains. Of course, this would also mark the end of Oscar's run with the group too, as it happened because, with him only even having taken the role in the first place because he felt it would allow him to be a positive role model to young children, he quickly decided that turning heel would be a spit in the face to each and every one of them. So now, without a manager to rein them in, Mabel and Mo would go on a reign of terror as, with the focus now shifting more and more towards the former being the star and the latter being his hype man, the Goldsboro native would set his sights on becoming the next King of the Ring. Now, it should be said that, at this point, the King of the Ring was still a highly prestigious title to hold, with the only two televised competitions by then seeing both Bret and Owen Hart come out the winners. That was why being given the opportunity to win such a title was considered a major step forward in your career in 1995, something which fans understood all too well. That's why what happened next shouldn't really have come as a surprise then, because at the titular event on June 25, 1995, after Mabel went through The Undertaker en route to the finals of the tournament, he'd handily defeat Savio Vega in just over 8 minutes to be crowned the new King of the Ring, all to a chorus of "Go away heel heat." Yes, it should have been a career-defining moment for him, one which rocketed him up to the main event picture and solidified him as a top star for years to come. The only problem with this idea, though, was that it ended up taking place at the climax of one of the worst pay-per-views WWF ever put on, something which had left the notoriously raucous Philadelphia crowd angry as it was. That's right, this was ECW country, and so the hardcore fans there that night had little interest for the terrible mid-90s WWF product, or any of the new ideas that Vince McMahon was trying to push on them. Sure, maybe if one of the more popular performers on the roster like The Undertaker or Shawn Michaels had won the tournament, then things might have been different. But with Mabel being seen as the next pet project of Vince McMahon on account of his size, he would find himself being met with a particularly hostile reception as he was coronated at the top of the entranceway. And as we said before, this was not the good kind of heel heat. This was the kind of heat which caused people to end up changing the channel, something which must have caused worry among some backstage at the time. That said, one person who certainly wasn't worried was Vince McMahon, because in another example of his trademark stubbornness, he would decide that the Philly fans didn't know what they wanted, and that once they and everyone else had seen Mabel get his main event run, their minds would be changed. So pushing forward then, the boss would announce that, as his new heel project had won the King of the Ring, this would make him the #1 contender to then WWF champion Diesel, someone who was having as equally difficult a time getting over as the company's top babyface. Yes, 1995 was a dark time for the company, and it would all lead to them putting on one of the worst SummerSlam main events of all time soon after this when, on August 27th, after a brutal 9 minutes and 14 seconds, the reigning champ would successfully defend his title against the heel challenger. But that wouldn't have been so bad for Mabel if he'd at least been able to win the fans over with a good performance that night. Unfortunately for him, though, this was not what happened, as with his skills always lying more in his imposing presence rather than his technical talents, fans would pretty much reject the whole thing as it was happening. And to make matters even worse, towards the end of the bout, the Carolina boy had almost managed to cripple Diesel when he botched a sit-down move on his back, accidentally putting all the weight of his 487-pound frame on his opponent's lumbar. When he got backstage then, Vince McMahon would be so angry that he was prepared to fire the big man on the spot, something which was only stopped when Diesel intervened and managed to talk him down. That said, even if he was still employed, this would mark the end of Mabel's run on top of the card because, with the boss no longer being able to trust him in the ring with his champion, he'd move him on to other opponents, such as The Undertaker. And of course, this program was expected to see Mabel quickly learn from any mistakes he made going forward, as being in the ring with probably the most respected man on the roster, there was going to be no sympathy for him if he screwed up this time. That was why it was so unfortunate then that, during a match with the Dead Man not long after this, a botched leg drop would lead to the big man cracking the orbital bone of his opponent, something which only further increased his reputation for being reckless in the ring. And with The Undertaker now being forced to wear a Phantom of the Opera-style face mask as a result of this, management would grow even more frustrated with the Carolina native, with this being what led them to dropping him from TV for a while after this, all before releasing him from his contract altogether in early 1996. So, now needing to find work elsewhere then, Nelson Frazier would spend some time down in Puerto Rico performing for the World Wrestling Council, there having a notable feud with Carlos Colon, and at one point even winning their Universal Heavyweight Championship. But that wasn't all he was doing because, while he was reigning as the top champion down south of the border, back up in Tennessee, he'd wrestle for Jerry Lawler once more too, becoming both the USWA Heavyweight Champion and the North American Heavyweight Champion during his time there. On top of that, he'd also spend some time over in Japan performing at the Inoki Festival in Yoyogi, all before making a special one-night appearance at Extreme Championship Wrestling's November to Remember in 1998. And this would eventually get back to Vince McMahon, who, now seeing someone who appeared to have improved a lot in the ring since the last time he'd worked with him, would decide to bring the big man back in full-time a couple of months later, having him show up as a surprise entrant during the 1999 Royal Rumble. But while he would end up getting eliminated from this match, that would ultimately be done with a purpose, because afterwards, he'd be kidnapped and indoctrinated into the Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness, there being rebranded as Viscera, one of the most feared lieutenants of the group. Sure, his ring gear may have made him look like a rejected Cenobite from the Hellraiser series, but that didn't matter to the late 90s audience because, being all in on the camp soap opera style story of the dead man's hostile takeover of WWF, they would only be too happy to forget about both this and Nelson Fraser's prior failed run as Mabel. So taking this new lease on life and running with it then, he'd start working his way through the mid-card from there, at various points alternating between singles action and acting as a tag partner to his fellow Ministry member Mideon as they went after the tag team titles. But while Viscera and Mideon would never be able to win these titles together during this period, the big man would finally get the opportunity to pick up some singles gold of his own while with WWF when, at WrestleMania 2000 on April 2nd of that year, he'd briefly become the Hardcore Champion during a Battle Royal. Of course, even if he'd then go on to lose it back almost immediately, it didn't remove it from the record books, with this victory giving him a small piece of redemption after the disaster that had been his first run with the company. That said, despite him having improved in pretty much every aspect since then, the boss still didn't see enough in Viscera to place him any higher on the show at this point, and that was why, after his time in the mid-card ran its course and the Ministry disbanded, the big man would be released from his contract that August. This then meant that he would once again have to return to the indie circuit for the next few years, with him mostly taking jobs over in the UK now, all while he was still getting to do a few dates in America, of course, such as when he faced off against Rocky Johnson, the father of The Rock, in a boxing match for Jerry Lawler's Memphis promotion. As well as that, he would manage to make a couple of brief appearances for Total Nonstop Action Wrestling in 2003 too, siding with Ron Killings there and helping him hold on to the NWA World Heavyweight title. But despite getting decent reactions wherever he went, none of these ventures would ever lead to anything more permanent for him. No, it wouldn't be until 2004, in fact, that something full-time would come the Goldsboro native's way once more when, much to his surprise, WWE would come calling and offer him a third chance. Yes, apparently deciding that now was the time to bring Fraser back and give him one more shot, Vince McMahon would call him in to join forces with JBL and attack their former leader, The Undertaker, in September of that year. And after making a suitable impact with this then, Viscera, as he was now once more being known as, would be moved over to the Raw brand where, after spending his first few months there getting back in management's good graces by mostly wrestling on Heat, he'd finally get something to sink his teeth into in April of 2005 when he aligned himself with Trish Stratus during her feud with Lita and Kane. And it was also during this period that the big man would start to show a whole new side to his character when, after working together with Stratus for a while, he'd start putting the moves on her, only for this to be rebuffed. Still, as the now self-proclaimed world's largest love machine, Viscera wouldn't let this slow him down. No, instead he'd simply hit the Canadian with a big splash at that May's Backlash, a move which formally turned him babyface once more. After that, he would take to wearing Hugh Hefner-style pajamas wherever he went, all as he was continuing to flirt with other women on the roster, the most notable of which was ring announcer Lillian Garcia. In fact, so intent would he be on winning Garcia's affections that, week after week, he'd constantly be coming up with new ways to woo her. And this then was something which would ultimately pay off for him when at June 26th's Vengeance, she would profess her love for Viscera and even go as far as to propose to him in the middle of the ring. Of course, as the world's largest love machine and an eternal playboy, there was no way the big man was ever going to commit to one woman, so after Lillian popped the question, the Carolinian would start having second thoughts, with this being what led him to accept the offer of a number of the Godfather's hoes instead when he hit the ring at this point too, and tried to explain to him all the things a Lothario like him would be missing out on if he tied the knot. So now, with this brief summer romance behind him then, the big man would move on to forming a tag team with another man of leisure in WWE, Val Venis. and going by the name V², they would work together for the next 9 months, usually appearing on secondary shows like Heat, but occasionally making it up to Raw. That said, despite their best efforts to do so, they would never win tag team gold during this period. And that was why, when Venus was injured in April of 2006, Viscera would decide it was best to return to singles action once more. But before he did that, he had a fence to mend with Lillian Garcia, something he set about doing by trying to win her affections all over again. Of course, when she rejected this, saying she would rather just be friends with him, it would cause the big man to get angry all over again, as from there, he delivered yet another slam to her, severing things once and for all. After that, he would spend a brief period working as a tag team with Charlie Haas, all until Haas reunited with Shelton Benjamin, that was, and Viscera would undergo his latest attempt at rebranding himself. Yes, this was the birth of Big Daddy V, ECW's newest monster who would make his debut on the brand in June of 2007, ready and willing to destroy everyone and everything in his path. Of course, for as intimidating as Nelson Frazier tried to be in this role though, he was hobbled pretty quickly by having some of the worst ring gear known to man, something which, let's just say, wasn't flattering to his upper body. Still, he would soldier on regardless, acting as the hired muscle for Matt Striker during his early weeks there as he mowed through figures such as the Boogeyman and Tommy Dreamer. And this would ultimately see him become #1 contender to CM Punk's ECW title at one point, with him being set to face off against the Voice of the Voiceless at that October's No Mercy pay-per-view. Sadly though, Big Daddy V would not come out victorious in this one. No, he would end up losing via disqualification instead, something which then sent him spiraling off into a feud with Kane in the weeks that followed. Then, once that feud was over, the Carolinian would run out what remained of his time in the company by appearing in both the 2008 Royal Rumble and Elimination Chamber matches, ultimately failing to make much of an impact in either. And that would all lead to his last match with WWE on March 11th of that year when, upon losing to CM Punk once more, he'd be released from his contract for the third and final time, forcing him to once again go look elsewhere for work. Luckily though, with him now having a couple of runs in New York under his belt, Nelson Frazier was able to find easy work on the indies going forward, as over the next 5 years, he would show up in promotions as far and wide as the National Wrestling Alliance, Juggalo Championship Wrestling, the Inoki Genome Federation, Qatar Pro Wrestling, and several other smaller local companies in Mexico, Canada, and Germany. On top of that, he would also get to have a brief but notable run over in All Japan Pro Wrestling, where he wrestled as Big Daddy Voodoo, with him there winning the All Asia Tag Team Championships with Taru and becoming a member of the Voodoo Murders stable. Unfortunately though, this would also mark his last run in the ring, as on February 18, 2014, he'd suffer a massive heart attack, something which ultimately ended his life at just 43 years old. Yes, Nelson Frazier, like so many of his peers, was taken at far too young an age. That said, it should never be forgotten that, for the time he was here, he did manage to leave behind a legacy of being one of the most consistent figures in WWE. Sure, the initial attempt to push him as the company's top heel might have failed to catch on, but that aside, he did carve out a spot for himself on the roster, which led to him continually being able to return over the years. In fact, throughout the New Generation era, Attitude era, and Ruthless Aggression era, he was usually there in some form or another, never the star of the show, but always making enough of a splash so as to remind people that he still had a mission to complete, and that mission was to entertain the fans in attendance, each and every night. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.